Please be advised that the nutrition recommendations provided in this video are of a general nature for cancer survivors. Individual nutritional requirements are subject to variance based on various factors. Please consult with a healthcare provider for a tailored prescription. The nutritional information and advice presented are in no way intended as a substitute for medical consultation.
Welcome, I'm Ann Keel Dux. I'm a cancer survivor thanks to my treatment at Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center. This series, developed by Sylvester's lifestyle medicine experts, is dedicated to us, cancer survivors at any stage of our journey looking to improve our dietary habits. After all, diet is something we can take charge of. A healthy diet can improve our symptoms, our overall health, and prevent cancer from coming back. Today, we are talking about all things nutrition labels. Joining me is Dr. Melissa Lopez. She is a registered dietitian and fellow at Sylvester.
Hi, Ann. Thanks for having me. Very excited to be here.
So let's first talk about the ACS recommendations so we can better understand what survivors should be thinking about.
Yes, of course. So the American Cancer Society recommends for survivors to adopt a predominantly plant-based diet. And what does that mean? It means consume foods that come from plants rather than animals. So this includes vegetables, fruits, whole grains, avoid red and processed meats and added sugars, and overall just stick to the rule of thumb of eating more plants and less animals.
The adding. And so if you want to learn more information about the ACS recommendations and how to make a healthy plate, check out our last video. But we want to dive in right now. Let's begin. Let's talk about these familiar but unfamiliar nutrition labels. What should we be looking at? What should we be paying attention to?
We're gonna give an example of these cookies that we have right here, and we're gonna pull up the nutrition label. This is what you can find on prepackaged foods. So again, it's this little box of information that is a breakdown on what is in the food item. So to start here at the top, we can see that we start with serving sizes. And what are serving sizes? So you see two different numbers. One is the total number of servings per the full package versus a smaller portion of it. So for this example, we see that the rest of the nutrition label is gonna speak to this serving size. So the rest of the nutrition label is gonna tell us what's in 2 cookies. So the first category we see here is the calories. Now, looking at calories alone doesn't really tell us much because we don't know what is feeding those calories, where are those calories coming from. So then that's why we want to look at the rest of the label. We have categories like total fat, and under this category, we have a breakdown of saturated fats and trans fats. For fats, what we really want to take a look at is the saturated fats. Saturated fats are what we call the unhealthy fats. In some nutrition labels, you will find additional information like unsaturated fats, monounsaturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, and those tend to be the ones that we call healthier fats. Then we have cholesterol, sodium, and those two are often components that we want to limit, or we want our foods to have low amounts of those. And at the bottom, we have carbohydrates. This is one important category because it tells us a wealth of information. To begin, we have dietary fiber. Fiber is one of the foods that or the components that we want our foods to have high amounts of. Fiber is one of the most anti-inflammatory food components, and we want to consume enough of that in our diets. Then we have total sugars, and total sugars is composed of 2 different categories. We have added sugars, which, just like it sounds, are sugars that were added and weren't naturally present in the foods. And sometimes you'll see in some nutrition labels that we have natural sugars, which are those that were naturally in the foods that we're eating. We have protein, and again, protein, that's something that we often take a look at to know if we're meeting our recommendations. And then at the bottom, we can see the micronutrients. So some foods are going to be good sources of certain vitamins or minerals, or some other foods are not going to have much of those things. So at the bottom, you'll see that it tells you that the daily percentage value which is this category right here, and these percentages, it tells you sort of where you're landing in meeting certain recommendations. As a rule of thumb, a percentage of 5 and below, it's considered a low source, and a 20% of more is considered a high source. So let me give you an example. For total fat, for example, we have a 9, which means 9% of your total fat during the day, you're eating in these 2 cookies. Now, if you eat more than 2 cookies, then you're eating more than that 9%. So for things like sodium, you want to find percentages that are on the lower, closer to the 5. And for things like fiber, you want to find things that are closer to the 20%.
So that's great, because you're not just looking at what the grams are. That may not necessarily translate, but you're also looking at the percentages, so you can think about my whole day.
Yes, exactly. And then we have also the ingredients at the left and that green box. And the ingredients list, a good rule of thumb is if it sounds like a tongue twister, that's probably not an ingredient that you want to have in your diet, or too much of at the very least. So having whole ingredients and things that we know, like eggs and things of that sort, are ingredients that we want to have in our ingredients list. And then lastly, we have our allergens. So if you have a dairy allergy, a nut allergy, this is where you're going to find if there's any of those ingredients in that food.
So let's look into the added sugars that you mentioned before. We have yogurt here that we can use as the perfect example to really compare those.
Yes, and importantly is, even when you're working or trying to look at added sugars from same brands, it can be a completely different story. So if we look at the nutrition label, I can help walk you through how I would navigate that to really make the best decision. So we have 2 products, and the first step is to always compare and make sure that you're comparing the same amounts. So in this example, we can see we have the amount of 170 grams compared to 170 grams. So that's the first step. If these amounts are different, you may have to do a little bit more math to figure it out, but you want to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples, right? So just looking at this nutrition label, we can see that one has more calories than the other one, but as we learned, that does not tell us the full story. So then we walk through the other examples. So the first category was total fat, and the one we talked about and highlighted was saturated fat. So we can see that for the first item, there is 1 gram of saturated fat compared to 0 grams of saturated fat. So that starts telling you a little bit of which way we're gonna lean towards. The next category that we have is sodium. This one has 75 grams and this one has 50 grams. There really isn't that much of a difference between the 2 quantities, so we want to look at something else that marks the difference between the 2 items. So then we're going to go to the total carb category, and under this category we have the added sugars. We can see that the first item has 16 grams of added sugars compared to 0 grams of added sugars. So then we have a winner, a clear winner. Added sugars tend to be one of the most inflammatory foods and food components that you can eat in your diet. And that can be hidden in so many foods, so that's where we really have to be careful.
So yogurt was helpful when we talk about breakfast. When we talk about granola bars, a lot of us are on the go every single day, and it looks small, but then you wonder what's inside. So talk us through this label.
Absolutely. In granolas, we think of granolas as a healthy item, so you're exactly right. So similarly, we start with the quantities, 40 versus 41. So that's just something to keep in mind. Sometimes you're not going to have the same amount, but it can still give you a clear example of how to compare between 2 items. One has more calories than the other one, but remember, this item on the right, it's a little bit of a higher amount. So just keeping that in mind, we're going to look at something that really marks the difference between the 2 items. In this case, we have saturated fat with 3 grams, and this one has 1 gram. And then in the next case, this is one example of a nutrition label that also outlines unsaturated and monounsaturated fats. So those tend to be the healthier fats, something to highlight there. But then going back to the sugars, so we saw that in this case, this has 4 grams of added sugars compared to 0 grams of added sugars. So far, there isn't really anything that really pulls the decision one way or the other. So sometimes the products are going to be very similar. So then we're going to continue to compare items in the food label. So the other category is fiber. And fiber is one of those that we really want to have in our diets. This on the left has 7 grams of fiber versus 4 grams of fiber. So if we're really trying to compare, we have more healthy fats on the left and we have higher fiber content. So then that's how I will lean more towards the left item.
And so we are talking a lot about sugar, and it's hard not to notice these cups along the side here. And for one, I see the highest amount of sugar here.
Yes.
And this is a little scary. Talk to me about what is associated with that cup of sugar.
Yes, so drinks is one of the ways that most Americans consume added sugars. And in fact, that's one of the items that if you're really trying to cut back on added sugars, if you start paying attention to what you're drinking, that's where the majority of your added sugars are going to be coming from. So in this example, we have 2 different beverages, and you can see the amount of sugar that we have in these 2 examples. So looking at the nutrition label, again, we're going to look at serving size, but if we're looking at added sugars, we can see that one has 22 grams and the other one has 54 grams of added sugar. So that's already way more than what we should have in a full day. So sometimes we don't drink just 1 bottle, we drink 2 or 3 during the day. So that puts us way ahead of the goal for the day.
So we talk about the energy drinks and the coffee drinks that are in these bottles and cans. We need to make sure we're reading those labels much better. And so I look at all of this and I look at this cup and it makes me a little disappointed because I have a sweet tooth. I'm sure many of you do as well. What are some of the options that we do have that we can enjoy, even in moderation?
Yes, and it's all about balance. Eating healthy is about balance, and making small changes are going to have a big impact in your diet. So we have a couple of examples of things that can satisfy your sweet tooth. And something to highlight with sugars is that our senses, our taste buds, start getting used to the sweetness. So the more added sugars that you consume, the more you will crave them. As you transition into making changes in your diet and you slowly stop consuming those, you're gonna realize that you don't crave them as much as before. So you can start really satisfying that sweet tooth with items like dark chocolate that have a lot of nutrients and don't have as much as added sugars, or things like fruit. So fruit tend to satisfy that sweet tooth because it has naturally occurring sugars versus added sugars that we talked about.
And this looks a little celebration here. So
Yes.
chia seeds, fruit. This is really nice if you're having guests over or want a little celebration.
Yes, and even things like honey can really bring a little bit of sweetness to your fruit or your items, and it also tends to have more antioxidants as well. Something to keep in mind as well is the recommendation for added sugars. So the American Cancer Society recommends not consuming more than 24 grams of added sugars per day. Now, that's not saying you should eat 24. It means that if you're going to consume added sugars, the max that we want you to stay at is 24 grams per day.
Earlier, you mentioned fiber. Is it important? What should we be thinking about when we say, okay, we need to add this to our diet every day?
Absolutely. Fiber is one of the most anti-inflammatory foods. It aids in digestion and it promotes gut health, all of which are very important for cancer prevention.
And so when we think about the foods that we most commonly eat, and we're looking at bread here, white bread and a whole wheat bread. What should we know about the fiber that's inside what often is a typical dish, a sandwich that we can have on a regular basis?
Yes, absolutely. I love bread. So it's important to highlight a couple of things to keep in mind when you're choosing your own breads. So we're going to go back to comparing 2 nutrition labels for white versus whole wheat bread. So looking at the first one, the first point and where we always start is, are we comparing the same amounts? So in the first example, we can see that the serving size is 2 slices and it's about 57 grams. In the second example, we're working with 1 slice and 34 grams. So that's just something to keep in mind. The amount in the first one, it's about double. So looking at fiber, we can see that both have around 3 grams of fiber. However, remember that you're getting 3 grams of fiber in 2 slices in the first example versus getting 3 grams in 1 slice of the second example. The second thing I want to highlight is the fact that from the total carbohydrate section, we also are working with sugars. So what we talked about before, added sugars tend to sneak in many of our foods. And in the second example, we see that we have no added sugar. So this is one of the good examples of how you can be at the grocery store and select the best of several options that you have.
Right, so wheat over white when we can. And
Yes.
so obviously there's fiber in bread, so we have 1+ as we get through our day. But what are the foods that are high in fiber that we say, you know what, let's do some additions here?
Yes, so going back to our initial point is if you to eat a healthier diet and you're consuming those plant-based foods, a lot of them have high amounts of fiber. So vegetables, fruits, whole grains. So some specific examples, we have quinoa, for example, that has about 6 to 8 grams of fiber per cup. We have fruits like strawberries and guava. So strawberries have around 8 grams of fiber per 100 grams. Guava around 5 grams of fiber per 100 grams. So those are great examples of things you can add to your diet to start hitting those fiber goals. So now that you know how to read a nutrition label, remember we talked about saturated fats, added sugars, and fiber. And we want to consume in foods that are high in fiber and foods that are lower in added sugars.
So thank you so much, Dr. Lopez. It has been wonderful and extremely insightful. You broke down these sometimes daunting nutrition labels for us. Thank you for joining us here today. And don't forget to check out our video on grocery shopping tips to learn how you can use your new nutrition label reading skills to upgrade your grocery game. See you next time.